Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show. As promised, as billed, author, environmental campaigner, former MEP, father of Boris Johnson, Stanley Johnson, joins me now in the studio.
Father of quite a few others, actually, too.
Actually, father of a lot of children. A lot of very successful children, not just a former Prime Minister. That's a good point. I might ask you about your parenting skills later. However, first of all, let's talk about Marco Polo, the subject of your latest book.
I have been so lucky, so lucky. I set off in 1961. That's over 60 years ago, with Tim Severin and Michael Larrabidi on a motorcycle to try and get from Venice to China on a motorcycle. Well, we got right to the Chinese border, and 62 years later, with my son Max, we have had a chance to finish that journey off, and I did 8 weeks this summer. One Tribe TV, working together with Chinese CCTV, put a fantastic team in the field, and we went from mountain to mountain, from prairie to prairie. We went from the Himalayas.
We're seeing some footage now. It looks absolutely
We went from the Himalayas.
Fabulous.
Oh, that's it.
Were you on the back of a motorbike, though, Stanley? That's what I want to know.
Well, we were. Not as our main means of transport, but I certainly got on motorcycle once or twice.
You and your son there.
That's where we are. We are coming down now from the Hypermeers towards Kashgar. That, by the way, that was the glacier. That's one of the biggest glaciers in China. It's a 7,000 footer, that mountain.
Wow.
7,000
so for those listening on the radio,
meters.
by the way, we're looking at footage now, Stanley and his son Max, and they're kind of going through
look, that's me on a yak.
Road.
That is me mounted on a yak, and actually it's a yak race. You could say it's a wacky yak.
Yacked. I mean, of all of the things you've achieved in your career so far, Stanley, I think yak racing is probably up there. Why should we care about Marco Polo?
Because he was fantastic. He was a man who set off from Venice with his uncle and his father, and he set off in 1271. It took him 4 years to reach China, and he...
4 years?
4 years. Well, he spent 1 year, for example, in Gansu at a town called Zhangye, which we also went to, and those are the biggest lying butter in the world in Zhangye. He spent 4 years, but he was able to take advantage of the peace and prosperity, which is, would you believe it, wrought by the Mongol Empire, the Mongol rule.
Yes.
You had Genghis Khan. Marco Polo had to pay homage when he got to Beijing to Kublai Khan.
Yes.
Kublai Khan, who was Genghis Khan's grandson. So, yes, it's very strange. For me, it was a historical revelation to realise.
I know, I love that you're calling this work, by the way. I mean, it looks absolutely fantastic.
Well, it was fantastic. But I have to tell you something. I have written a very serious book. It is 70,000 words. It's the first part, then it's the second part, as you might say. And here we are in the desert. That's some dancing going on. And it's going to be called In the Footsteps of Marco Polo, and it'll come out actually at the same time, I hope, as the film of this series, which, as I said,
film as well.
is full.
What number book is this, Stanley? Because I know you've written dozens.
You know, I'm afraid this is my 26th
26?
book. There were 13 novels, 13 fat books, and 2 volumes of autobiography.
Can we talk about China? Or China, as Donald Trump likes to describe it. Do you think I know you're a Sinophile. I know this about you. And therefore, do you think that we demonise China a bit too much in the West?
Well, I have been following China fairly closely, not as closely as people like Isabel Hilton, obviously. But I was actually part of the first EU delegation to go to China in 1975, August 1975. Mao was still in power. I think 10 or 15 of us went representing, in a sort of informal way, the EU. And I learned a lot then. I've been going back ever since. 3 of my novels have actually had a Chinese base.
Yes.
One was even called Dragon River, about how they built a huge dam called...
So are we mishandling our relationship with China?
No.
I mean, we've obviously got concerns about Taiwan being invaded.
Look, I'm a bit of a fan of the Osborne-Cameron golden era of Chinese relations. I'd like to see President Xi back in that pub in Chequers.
Really? What, with everything going on with Chinese spying and infiltration of Parliament?
Well, all I can say is I live by what I could see, and we had 8 weeks moving from place to place, being fairly unscripted, I've got to say. And I came out, but from my point of view,
because you're a Western
you very kindly introduced me as an environmentalist, and I looked at this. Every hilltop we saw had a wind turbine on it. the solar panels. Every desert had solar panels. Imagine you're a country like China.
I know, but China hasn't got the best record when it comes to fossil fuels, Stanley. I mean, we can't be holding it up as a beacon.
I will hold it up as a beacon.
What, even though it's building ever more power stations?
Well, what it is doing is really galloping down the renewable energies front. I mean, the other day, the Secretary General of the United Nations said we needed 11 terawatts.
Doesn't China account for, like, the majority of global carbon emissions?
No, it doesn't. It absolutely doesn't.
It is
a big emitter, as the EU is and as the United States is.
I'm glad you mentioned the EU. Should we talk about the EU and talk about the fact that obviously Keir Starmer is advocating a closer relationship with the EU? I know you love the EU. Therefore, would you be tempted to vote Labour at the next general election?
Nothing would tempt me to vote Labour.
Oh.
What would tempt me is a coherent policy now to rebuild bridges with Europe. I mean, it seems to me absolutely absurd that we are setting ourselves up, having come out, to say, oh, well, now we must more and more separate ourselves out.
Because
now,
as somebody close to you once said, leave means leave.
Well...
Is that not a point?
Marco Polo built bridges between East and West. I'm now in a bridge building mode, and I would like to see, for example, do you know something? I think I would vote for any political party which at this point said, I want to bring Europe, UK, back into the European Environment Agency. We were always there.
OK, well, therefore, you're voting for Starmer, then?
Well, no, he's not said that.
Well, he's almost said that.
No, he has not said that. He needs to say that. Because
if he said that, would you vote for him? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I might well. I tell you something, I might.
GB News exclusive alert, I might vote for Labour.
What is more important?
Says Stanley Johnson.
I tell you something, what is more important in the end? A political party or some absolutely massively important topic, which is the environment, which pins down what you can do for generations to come, and I would say that's more important.
All right.
You know, I would buy into any. By the way, if I go back to the, let's say, the 2015 Tory manifesto, which had a lot of good stuff, and I think my son Joe was pretty heavily involved in writing the 2015 manifesto. I'll vote for anybody.
Did you not like the 2019 manifesto? Somebody you know as well as Joe, I think, was involved in writing that.
Well, I think Boris, if you're actually mentioning Boris, were you mentioning Boris?
I was mentioning Boris. Funny you should mention Boris. He's the subject again of some speculation in this morning's papers.
I saw it. Something like 20,000 words by Camilla.
Yes, that's right.
Germany.
I did write a long piece yesterday about whether
I read it.
Boris should be brought back to Henley. What do you think?
Well, you actually slipped into the fact that Henley already had a candidate.
I know, but it has a candidate that's very close to Boris Johnson, and I thought that was significant.
You'd have to be pretty close to say, yeah, I've actually been selected as the Tory party in candidate, and now I'm not going to say as well deselect. Although I noticed today you were running a piece about de-arresting people.
Oh, so maybe deselecting is a thing. Voluntary deselection. But to be serious for a moment, presumably you've had conversations with your son, of whom you're extremely proud, and therefore...
And whom I am well pleased. Indeed
so. And so if there was a call from Rishi Sunak for him to go back to campaign, and indeed he had a Cincinnatus-style sort of inkling that he wants to come back, would you... I mean, is that credible? Would you support
I noticed your Cincinnatus reference in that piece.
Well, he made
Cincinnatus actually came back, and I don't think the fate which greeted Cincinnatus on his return was totally to be emulated. No, do you know something? I think I would take a pretty tough line, and if my eldest son were to say to me, look, Dad, I'm thinking of, starting again off in politics. Would you support me? I say, look, I'm going to make a pretty tough bargain here, Boris. In terms of my support, I'm only going to support you coming back into the political fray if you start really pushing again on the environmental stuff, which you push very hard on, and if you really say, look, I may have been responsible for Brexit, but now my job is to rebuild that bridge. So those are two pretty firm bids I'd make before I voted again.
Well, it sounds like you're going to be saying to him, you'll have to do this, otherwise I might vote for Keir Starmer.
Well, I think he'd have to take this very seriously. I think he would have to take the threat of parental disapproval.
I'm not sure if I want to be around the Johnson dinner table for that debate, but do you concur with people who say, Stanley, that he could prove to be the saviour of the Tory party, a Tory party on its knees right now?
Well, again, I'm going to say I would make a conditional on this one. I don't think the Tory party is going to be saved by a move to the right. The Tory party is going to be saved by someone who says, look, we were going well, it was steady as you go.
But then Boris isn't on the right, so he could be the saviour of the centre.
Well, I'm on for that. I'm absolutely on for that. For example, you take plastics.
Yes.
Plastics, a world issue, a fantastically important issue. I mean, I happen to believe that we ought to be making a lot of fuss about plastics.
So if he makes fuss about plastics, then you'll vote for him if he were a future Tory leader and not Keir Starmer. I think we've nailed down that at least today, Stanley. We look forward to your book and indeed your film on Marco Polo. Thank you very much indeed for joining me and for joining in a little bit of joshing, which is charitable of you. Thank you.